Oops. Oh.
Nice job. Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoyed it. Really very interesting. Give me your card if you would. You have a card? Will you email me?
Thanks.
Good. Thank you. Wanted to get out of the way here. Ethan, nice
Give
to
you my card too. Thank you. I hope I
Likewise.
didn't steal too much
You
of your
really
thunder.
didn't. Thank you so much. Great to meet you. I do a lot of back and forth with Walker Smith.
I know you do.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
know
yeah.
you do.
She's a Hey, hi, Jay. How are you? Good to see you. Everything going well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're under the gun.
The new boss is behaving himself. Scott? Good.
Bring in some money.
Oh, I'm sure that's important. Hug, huh? Hug.
Are you guys actually co-sponsoring this, or are you just?
No.
Okay. We'll say hi to Scott. I know this environmental governance is his legacy. Oh, are you now the official? All right, congratulations. That's awesome. Not that it's any surprise. Oh, so you're continuing your old role?
No.
So they're not gonna-
Sketching.
they've been confined. You're a busy man.
Yeah.
It's good to see you. I'm going to stick around for this.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
So I'll say in a second, that was a fascinating panel because it covered from the global all the way down to the community level.
Exactly. Let's.
I definitely want to. And I was having made contact with you guys. I definitely
All
want
right, good.
Where do you want me?
Where do you want to go?
to. So I was going to say, we can meet next to each other here. Or
Yeah.
that work? Okay, I'll put you next to the podium. Does that work for you?
Yep.
Let me get 2 glasses. You're going to be up here too, Joel?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't need one.
Okay.
I'll let Jay have it.
Thanks.
Oh, not fine. Thanks, Megan.
I think we've got it. Yeah. Okay. Good?
Session fairly quickly. And for this last session, the way we're going to structure it is I'm going to ask Jay Pendergrass to make some remarks for 10 to 15 minutes. And then he and I, much as we started the day, will engage in a discussion, but in which hopefully you'll be active. So many of you having stayed on for the whole day or for the whole afternoon. The only thing I need to add is, before I introduce him, is that Jay Pendergrass is one of the rare people who I introduced who's deleted a word from his title. Most people add a word. But he's no longer the acting vice president. He now is the vice president for research and programs at the Environmental Law Institute. It's my pleasure to have him keynoting this closing discussion.
Thank you, Joel. And I'm going to pick up on a mention that Patty made briefly. ELI is, we want to thank actually Patty and Arnold Karlhuber, who is with the Division of Environmental Law and Conventions at UNEP, who have asked us to produce the first comprehensive global report on environmental rule of law to be released at the UN Environment Assembly in May. And so we are in the very much in the midst of working on that. The senior team includes Carl Brook, who I think has been mentioned a couple of times today, me, and then several of our visiting scholars, our distinguished judicial scholar, Meredith Wright, who's here. We have an economist on the team, Carol Jones, and Kim Smazniak, who was a visiting attorney with us for a while, has just recently joined the Department of State. But I was going to, Patty stole some of my thunder because I was going to quote the Secretary General's definition of rule of law. But I will say that from what she quoted, Secretary General went on to emphasize particularly important aspects. So I'll continue with that quote, that the rule of law requires as well measures to ensure adherence to principles of supremacy of law, equality before the law, accountability to the law, fairness in the application of the law, separation of powers, participation in decision-making, legal certainty, avoidance of arbitrariness, and procedural and legal transparency. Just last May, UNEP issued an issue brief that tried to distill much of this into one sheet. As a part of that, UNEP listed 7 aspects of the rule of law, they follow on what we were talking about, but we're using that as a template for report on the environmental rule of law at a global level, so I think it's worth identifying them. So fair, clear, and implementable environmental laws, public participation in decision-making and access to justice, information in environmental matters, Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration, accountability and integrity of institutions and decision-makers, and specifically calling out both environmental auditing and enforcement, clear and coordinated mandates and roles in institutions, accessible, fair, impartial, timely, and responsive dispute resolution, recognition of the mutually reinforcing relationship between human rights and the environment, and specific criteria for the interpretation of environmental law. So we are very much still trying to find the good examples of how environmental rule of law is working around the globe, but I did want to maybe try and flesh some of this out. Much of it has been discussed already today, but just to give you a flavor of how we're looking at things and what the status is to the extent that we can on a global basis. So starting with laws, and we're not going to try and get into the substance of environmental law, but rather that as the definition refers to, that there are fair, clear, and implementable environmental laws, that they exist. What makes them fair, clear, and implementable? And so there are characteristics of law, and particularly environmental law. There are standards. Environmental laws employ standards, both mandatory and voluntary. There are information-based approaches. There are incentive-based approaches. Those can include both the ones that we may be more used to, market-based mechanisms, but also liability can be a incentive-based approach. And then the property and land use based laws. One of the important things that we will highlight is the importance of matching the tools to the problem, and that certain of those aspects of laws are appropriate in some situations and inappropriate in others. So try to look at when are standards appropriate. Ambient environmental standards are clearly important in order to see where a country is, and that's been discussed today. But the information-based approaches, we've had some discussion of how they can work. They're good for some things, and incentive-based instruments as well And then the regulatory tools that in the U.S. we're very familiar with, of permits, environmental impact assessment, et cetera, have turned, particularly environmental impact assessment, has turned out to be a very effective mechanism in many parts of the world, but also sometimes not so effective. Public participation in decision-making and access to information is something that I don't think I have to go into the importance or why we're dealing with it. I did want to maybe note some of the challenges to implementing these that we've noted, and that's states that refuse to provide opportunities because they're worried about criticism of their policies and how they're implementing them. More common, well, that's a fairly common one. Another common one is the tick box view of public participation, that you're gonna because it's required, you're gonna put something out there and you're going to say, okay, here's the information, we've done that, we're good, off we go. So that opportunity for actual participation in decisions is not really there. So Ethan talked about consultations. That's relatively less frequent in many developing countries. The notice and comment procedure that we're so used to in the U.S. is actually relatively uncommon in many developing countries. ELI had the opportunity a number of years ago to actually help Liberia implement its first notice and comment rulemaking procedure in the forestry sector, and actually went beyond to saying, going out to communities, presenting what the proposed regulations were, and then seeking comment at the time. But that's something that definitely needs to be improved on. And then one of the key issues with this is the literacy and language, and particularly in very diverse countries where you may have multiple languages, that it's important to make sure that you're making the information available in languages that the people can actually understand and use. So then the implementation and accountability mechanisms, and these are, in a, I think, very real sense, the heart of rule of law. It's about implementing what the content of the laws are, and assuring that it is implemented in that fair, consistent, equal, non-arbitrary manner. And so there are a number of ways that, of tools that are used. Obviously, enforcement is one that's been talked about a lot today. But it's not just enforcement. The use of data is becoming much more important, and it ties in with the information aspects. But the collection, management, and use of data is critically important to the implementation of rule of law. Environmental auditing is something that we're trying to get a better handle on, but there are many countries, particularly civil law countries, that have auditors as an independent agent within the government to audit all aspects of how government is carrying out its responsibilities. They are largely independent, sometimes have their own court systems for reviewing the results. And these auditors are now beginning to develop some experience and expertise with the environmental responsibilities. John mentioned capacity building. That's a very important part of raising the ability of the institutions to implement environmental laws and to be able to assure that rule of law is implemented. And as you said, the Environmental Law Institute has had a program for 25 years trying to educate judges about environment. We've worked in more than 25 countries with UNEP, with EPA, with Department of Justice, and in actuality, we'll work with anyone to do this if you've got the entree to judges. It truly is a critical aspect of it that we have been pleased to be a part of. I will say that it seems to have been a growing movement, and judges across the globe are very interested in it, and there has been a movement by judges to create a global judicial institute for the environment, which is anticipated to be launched at World Congress on Environmental Law in Rio at the end of April. So hopefully that will come off as planned, and then judges will be working together to encourage their colleagues in every country to learn more about environmental law. The other aspect of that the issue brief mentioned is the connection between human rights and the environment, and that is an important aspect. It's important to note that there is the connection, that environmental rule of law is not the same as the human rights, but that there is very definitely a connection, and we're going to try and at least highlight some of the examples. We have, unlike the Principle 10, we did separate access to justice and the dispute resolution aspect from the other two elements of Principle 10, partly because we do have this view that it's a vitally important aspect, and just wanted to note that the access to justice promotes accountability, and by augmenting and enforcing the rights, including information access for citizens, but all the rest of the substantive rights, but also allowing the public to vindicate their right to participate in decision making, and leveling the playing field between the government authority and its constituents. So if you remember back to the definition of rule of law, saying that that it requires that everyone is subject to the law, including the state itself. And this highlights the importance of the independent judiciary and its ability to assure that the state, as well as industry and citizens, are all subject to the rule of law. I just wanted to highlight one example of this. The Superior Tribunal de Justicia in Brazil, or the High Court of Brazil, was created in the 1988 Constitution. I got that right? I think that's, yeah. As a result of a concern that under the prior dictatorship, that there was insufficient independence of the judiciary, and that citizens were not getting the access to the judiciary that that they felt was necessary. And so Brazil has a Supreme Court, handles constitutional cases. The Superior Tribunal is essentially equivalent to the Supreme Court, but handles appeals from appellate courts, and it has a large number of judges. They handle a large number of cases. They televise their cases. The deliberations are public, so anyone can see what the judges are deliberating on. A way of very much ensuring that people can have faith in what the judiciary is doing because they can see it in front of them. I think with that I will close, and we did want to make this an opportunity for discussion, a final way to close it and just talk about the issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. I thought as we get started, I'd make maybe 4 very small observations that are triggered by Jay's remarks that cover, I think, some things that I've noticed or thought about a little bit during the day. The first goes back to our previous panel. Now, I say this somewhat recognizing that I'm the person who put together the previous panel. But as that panel was speaking, it really struck me, and I'm sure it was not lost on you, that we had in that mix a multilateral, national level, and then really 2 different views of the local level, a community participatory approach and then sort of a corporate private sector approach that really, in a way that we hadn't seen in the 2 previous panels, captured the full range of issues that comes up in this space, and where there is often synergy, but often also competing interest, and that there can be important opportunities to try to make sure that, particularly where UNEP, for example, is involved, the community approach isn't just lip service, but is really embraced in real meaningful ways, where the national, the local, I think about this a lot in South Carolina. My colleague Josh Eagle works even more than I do with the Department of Natural Resources in our state, and I was at an event last week with the General Counsel of DNR, and I was talking about this event, and she said, I wish I'd known about it, I would have flown up for it. And it hadn't even occurred to me to mention it to her. And yet, for many developing countries, the state level in the U.S. would be far more relevant in terms of shared experience. And you know, I think about it in other contexts, but in this context, it hadn't literally even occurred to me, even though I think of myself as someone who tends to think outside the box. The second thing is that this is an area where we've talked about corruption. It's been in the background a lot, but where many of the solutions run up against problems of corruption. So where regulation is the solution, additional regulation also creates additional opportunities for corruption. And thinking about how that balance is struck is, I think, an important consideration throughout. Third, on encouraging public participation, I was reminded of a conversation I had a few years ago with the then Minister of Culture of Guinea-Conakry, who was in Columbia, South Carolina for a visit, and while there, in talking about the Rule of Law Collaborative and the work we did, said, I would love to bring you out. We've just passed a new constitution, and it's important that we get the word out about what it means. And I literally, on the heels of that 15 seconds, having told myself a whole story, having grown up, I grew up in Sierra Leone, talked about the importance of getting outside of Conakry and really explaining what was going on. And he said, oh, no, I probably went on for 12 minutes. And he finally stopped me and said, that's not what I was talking about. I'm talking about the members of parliament who voted for the Constitution. None of them know what they voted on. And so, you know, thinking at the participatory level, but thinking across the board at sort of, particularly when there are external forces placing pressure, and the environmental arena is one of those areas where this happens, is there really, even at the governmental level, complete understanding, complete buy-in to what the expectations are and what the commitments are? And then finally, maybe this sort of connects directly, at the very beginning of the day and again today at the end, I thought of Rwanda, and I thought of Paul Kagame and the various regulatory reforms he's made over the course of the past several years. And one of the most successful and highly touted is actually in the wildlife conservation area, and it specifically relates to mountain gorillas. And one of the things that Rwanda has been held out as a success story for is reducing poaching. And the way that they've done that is twofold. First, by having very limited tourist interventions with very high costs, permits that are by day $500 to $600, and where the money from those permits, at least putatively, goes to the local community. And the second thing is to work with poachers to turn them into guides, to create opportunities for them to have successful gainful employment where that, importantly, and we talked about this earlier, outstrips the economic value of the alternative. And I think of that as a true success story in my own experience. But that runs up against other rule of law negative stories that are taking place in Rwanda at the same time, and it's just a reminder that the rule of law conversation is generally not a one-sided conversation, that some positive steps have negative implications and vice versa, and that it's a very complicated picture. It's not just a slow-moving one, but it's not as simple as we take X step and have Y benefit. There are often unintended or even intended negative consequences that we have to think about, particularly in the environmental space, I think. And so I sort of make all those observations in light of Jay's comments and the day's events, and want to open up for thoughts, comments, questions as we wrap up for the day. And there may be none. Yes.
Charlie Garlow, Jacob Stotsky Law Firm.
Oh, sorry. For recording purposes. We're making you work for this comment. I say go ahead and make the comment without the mic on.
Hello? There you go. Okay, Charlie Garlow, Jacob Stotsky Law Firm. As to your gorillas story, example, we'll go, thank you, there it is. It's his fault. Okay. We'll go out and say, hey, I'm going to go get some extra oysters or clams or something that they're not really allowed to do because I'd like to have a little extra money on the side.
Right. Well, in that case, there is also enforcement and regulation. So there's oversight by the local community and also by the equivalent of the Forest Service. So there's actually a fairly tight regulation. But one of the things that's interesting about what's happened in Rwanda is that there was immediate outreach as the regime of how the mountain gorillas were how that tourist industry was being handled to the local villages and the local communities. Because one of the other issues was that the gorillas came into the villages, and so there was sort of an effort to sort of create a buffer zone where the villages had to give up land, and so there was a trade-off, and there was community involvement, and that was very much a participatory process, which I should add is not an outcome of the Gacaca process and other communitarian processes in Rwanda. This is a sui generis, I think, experience that really relates to the particular region, the particular city in question. But it's a striking contrast, I should say, with Uganda, just on the other side of the same mountain, where there's much less community involvement and much less oversight. So it is a combination, and I think the answer is there's nothing to fundamentally ensure it, but a certain amount of both buy-in and regulation and oversight.
Yeah, I was going to add that where you have significant community involvement, then that can be a very important check on the local corruption, because the community is watching and either does their own pressure on people when whatever they're doing may harm the rest of the community, or bring it to the attention of authorities.
Yeah, this is not so much a question as a comment, and this has to do with sort of the future of environmental regulation. The sort of word on the street of environmental law professors is, that we're going to have more flexibility built into environmental regulation as we start to see less predictable or unpredictable change due to climate change and those kinds of things. And so what the story is, well, let's say we have wildlife that move from one area to another where they're not protected. We're going to add protection in the new area and take it away in the old area. And I guess my question is, since process seems to be the fundamental component of rule of law, right? Even it's sunshine adds, public input, but also the public able to see what's going on. Will it be possible to kind of follow rule of law when if we go to a faster decision model that cuts out a lot of the participatory process, right? That's what people are, liberal environmental professors are asking for that. And there's obviously concern that that would, you could hide a lot of things that were not necessarily meant to improve the environment in that framework. So I don't know the answer to that, but it's something to think about, is sort of speeding up the process to deal with climate change, but losing some of the rule of law component.
I guess I'll just add to the comment that in a system like ours, that argues for doing some of this at the most local level where process can be quicker, but you can still have process. It also suggests that, for us in the U.S., we haven't had much new law, but we do have the ability to make changes through the regulatory system, and so that's probably where where adaptive management, in the legal sense, can occur, and it's something that I think we need to, as environmental lawyers, think a lot more about. How can we have adaptive management in the regulatory system become much more of a way of operating?
Well, I think what Will Pomerantz from the Wilson Center has some very closing remarks, and I want to thank Jay again for helping us to wrap up this final session.
Thank you.
Great. I don't have any really closing remarks. I'm not going to try to wrap up or summarize the summary. I think we've already done that here.
thank
Joel and
you.
John have already done an outstanding job. I'm just here to deliver the final thank yous and administrative issues. For all of you who have stayed to the bitter end, your reward is you get to fill out the questionnaire before you leave. So if you could please do that. It's very important that we get the feedback and we get your thoughts about the conference. As I said, I'm just responsible for issuing the final thank yous. Thank you to all my colleagues at the Wilson Center, including the Environmental Change and Security Program that played such an important role in organizing today's event, and to the staff here at the Wilson Center who assisted, to the State Department and the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. And finally, I think the biggest thank you goes to Joel and to the Rule of Law Collaborative at the University of South Carolina. They did the lion's share of the work. They organized the conference, and I think it was just an extremely interesting and successful event, and I'm so glad that so many of you stayed throughout the entire day. So thank you, Joel. Thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you again at the Wilson Center.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic.
So I hope we have the opportunity to do some more things.
I'd really like that. I really like that. The environmental space is not my natural one,
Yeah.
but it's one I'd like to get more involved in. So particularly as you guys undertake this project, if there are ways that an outside set of eyes can be helpful.